Okay, well now we're recording. Welcome, Lynn. Did you remember to set your clock back this morning or up ahead? I did not. In fact, the first I heard that it was daylight savings time was this morning at around 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock, whichever one it was. Thankfully, I used my telephone as my alarm because I couldn't reconcile the time on my telephone with the time on all the clocks in my house. So
I'm afraid I'm with you. I rolled out
really?
at 7:30 and it was 8:30.
It just seems like it wasn't that well advertised this year. I don't know, or it wasn't for me. So excuse me. I'm going to get the clock here. I'm at the UCC church, and so I'm not aware of where the clocks are, but it just fell over, and so I need to go and pick that up. Okay, well, sorry to keep you. This morning, we're still looking at our Isenheim Altarpiece, and probably the one person that we could write, 3 or 4 weeks into the program just to, to cover it all. Mary, the mother of Jesus. Now, last time we looked at, for some reason there we go. The last time we looked at Mary Magdalene, and I wanted to give some opportunity for you to maybe ask any questions or bring up any points of interest that you may have had over the time that we've not been together. The main point I wanted to make about Mary Magdalene is that, like so much, as we're going to find out about Mary, the mother of Jesus, like so much in the Bible, what we think is there, what we think is true of the person and historically accurate is not always the case. We saw with Mary Magdalene that, history has, relegated her to the repentant sinner, the sinner being a prostitute. And there have been all kinds of stories about, the possibility that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were, married, if not lovers. Stories about Mary Magdalene, being excommunicated, if you will, from the Jewish community and sent across the Mediterranean, and setting up her home in France, where she gives birth to a child by Jesus, a young woman named Sarah, and this becomes the beginning of the so-called Merovingian line. All kinds of stories around, this particular woman who is not really a central player in the New Testament Gospels. She's not mentioned anywhere in the letters of Paul. She's not mentioned by the early church fathers. And in fact, she's only mentioned once in the Gospels prior to the crucifixion. She is a central figure at the crucifixion and at Jesus' resurrection. In the Gospel of John, she is the one who finds the tomb empty, the one to whom Jesus first appears and tells her to go and tell the disciples, the apostles, that he is risen. So ostensibly, she could be considered the apostle to the apostles. Apostle, the Greek word means to send. An apostle is one who is sent out to spread the word. And Mary is the first apostle. Something to remember as we think about the place of women in the structure and the organization of the church. Somewhere along the line, it came to be understood that women did not have a place when it came to proclaiming the gospel, in direct opposition to what we see in the resurrection story, right? A woman is the first person to proclaim the gospel. If the essence of the gospel is the resurrection, then Mary is the first person who is commissioned by Christ to proclaim that very aspect of the religious tradition. But today we're going to be able to have the opportunity to look at two Marys. And it's interesting, if we look at the Isenheim Altarpiece, we have 2 Johns and then 2 Marys. The 2 Johns are quite distinct from each other. And as we will find out, the 2 Marys are quite distinct as well. They were almost mirror images of the other, whereas one has been described as a repentant sinner who has lived a life of, not the most morally upright life, Mary Magdalene. The other is one who is who rises completely above sin, whose the birth of Jesus is so extraordinary and spectacular that that she was a virgin when Jesus was conceived, and at her death she remained a virgin. Now this, of course, there's nothing in the Bible that talks about this, but this is the tradition that rises up after that. So the repentant sinner and the Virgin Mother. The attire when we look at the Isenheim Altarpiece, we see Mary dressed in a way that we don't often see her in many other crucifixion scenes. She's being held by John the Evangelist, who is understood to be the so-called beloved disciple of Jesus. We'll have a chance to talk about him next week. Her hands held in prayer. She's got just the slightest notion of, or the slightest, I got just the slightest intimation here that she's wearing blue, which is the color that's associated with Mary, the Virgin Mary, the color of spirituality, the color of kind of mystical union with God. Mary, whenever you want to find Mary in any kind of Renaissance painting, she's always wearing blue. Now, by contrast, Mary Magdalene is usually dressed in some sort of, deep body red color, as would be appropriate to her station. But unlike many Renaissance paintings, in this one, Mary is, though she's dressed in blue underneath this garment, the garment on top is white. And you can see it looks like a nun's habit, which would be reflective of the kind of habits that would have been worn in the cloister at Isenheim. Remember, these were women who were called upon, women and men both, who were called upon to take care of those who were suffering from St. Anthony's fire, which racked their bodies with all kinds of pain, all kinds of debilitating sickness to the point of death. People having their limbs removed, amputated, because of the severity of this disease. So it's almost a tip of the hat, if you will, to an association between the religious in Isenheim, in the cloister, and the work of Mary, the mother of Jesus, the long-suffering mother. At the end of our talk today, I'll show you. You probably are aware of Michelangelo's Pietà, which is shows Mary as the suffering mother. But here she's not only the suffering mother, but also the suffering servant who cares for the sick, dressed in the same attire as you would find in Isenheim. So let's move on. Any comments or questions about that so far? You might remember that the Isenheim Altarpiece had 3 views. At the bottom, on the stand, you would always see this view of Jesus being taken down from the cross with Mary Magdalene behind Mary, the mother of Jesus, and John, the beloved disciple. But at different times of the year, the altarpiece would be open to various scenes from the Gospels, depending on the season. Scenes from the Gospels, as well as scenes from the life of St. Anthony, who was the patron saint of the cloister. And this one is one that is one that you would expect to see in a Catholic tradition in the Catholic Church in the early 16th century. I'm going to talk a little bit later on about how it is that Mary comes to be venerated rather late in Catholicism, and for reasons that are rather interesting. But by the early 16th century, there is a very, very strong tradition in the Catholic Church of Mary being venerated as a saint who is an intercessor. You were unaware or unfamiliar with the practice in the Protestant tradition of praying to saints as intercessors. Praying to Saint Anthony for healing, and praying to Saint Michael for, temptation against the work of the devil. Or there are certain patron saints for different obstacles that we face in life. But Mary, of course, was probably the saint par excellence, because she was the mother of Jesus. I mean, if you go to Mary and you pray to her, and she takes your concerns to Jesus, well, Jesus is going to listen to his mother, right? Interestingly enough, what we're going to find in the Gospels that Jesus really wasn't, in the few instances that we have where Jesus is talking to Mary, he's not very nice. He's not very nice to his mother, which I guess is typical of boys with their mothers, but Jesus comes across as kind of snippy sometimes, But the second view of the Isenheim Altarpiece features those aspects of the Annunciation and the birth of Christ that is so central to the Advent tradition. So at Advent, you would see on the left panel here the Annunciation. This is the angel Gabriel coming to Mary. Mary, appropriately in good Middle Eastern fashion, blonde and very pale skinned, right? Which, is not geographically or probably historically accurate. But then the central panel, the praise that's going on in heaven, the glory, the celebration that's going on in heaven with angels singing, the crown of the Messiah's crown being brought to Christ. And here she is holding the Christ child again, interestingly dressed in red, but draped in blue as well. I'm going to compare this image to a later image of Michelangelo's at the end of our discussion. So, and then you remember what the third view was like with the saints, Anthony. The Annunciation, the places, where do we hear about Mary in the Gospels? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the Annunciation, because we talked about that in an earlier Bible study at Advent. But it's understood that Mary is called upon to bear the child Jesus as the Messiah that at least since the 8th century, if not before BCE, the people of Israel had been awaiting. But this emphasis upon a Messiah, one who is going to come and whether politically or through warfare, take the Romans or take the oppressors out of Jerusalem, so that Judea, what was called Palestine at the time, could once again be the land of promise, the land of the Jews, where they could live and worship without any kind of oversight. But one thing that is important to know about Mary and the Annunciation happens in two different ways. We might remember from our earlier study. In Luke, it is this scene that we see in the Isenheim Altarpiece, where the angel appears to Mary, and she's got the book, if you can see my cursor, the book here in front of her, that this Messiah that she is now going to bear to the world is going to be the fulfillment of prophecy. This is the Messiah that had been waiting, that Israel had been waiting for. But there's another kind of annunciation that happens in the Gospel of Matthew, and that is the annunciation. You might remember that Matthew, being a more Jewish gospel, the conversation happens between the angel and Joseph. The angel tells Joseph, your wife, Mary, is with child. Don't dismiss her, as a good Jewish man might, because, here she is unmarried. She's your betrothed and she's with child. But all of this is going to be a fulfillment of prophecy. This is all a part of God's plan. And here's where we get the beginning of the idea that Mary, when Jesus was born, was a virgin, which means had not had up until that time any type of sexual relations. And I'm going to try to find this place in Isaiah for you. I've talked about this before, but it's really important to remember because so much grows out of it that it's important to know about in terms of how we get this idea of the so-called virgin birth, which really doesn't seem to make, I hate to say it, even though it's part of the Apostles' Creed, but for me, it would not matter if Jesus were born from a virgin or not, But there is a fulfillment of prophecy here that comes to be misunderstood. Now, in Matthew, when the angel speaks to Joseph, it says, and this is done to fulfill the prophecy in Matthew 1:23, and a virgin shall conceive and bear a child, right? And this is a prophecy that's in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. Now, chapter 7, verse 14, well, before I say this, I should say, when the Hebrew Bible was written, it was written, of course, in Hebrew. But there came a time in Jewish tradition, because of the way that Jews had spread out throughout the Roman, well, by that time, the Greek Empire, when the Hebrew Bible needed to be translated into Greek. And so you know how translations go. There's not always a good one-to-one correspondence between a Hebrew word and a Greek word. Now, this is what Isaiah 7, verse 14 says. And the context is the 8th century, when the prophet Isaiah is speaking to Ahaz and about a sign that wants to be given. And this is what the sign is. I'll just read it very, that Isaiah said, "Hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary mortals, that you weary my God also? Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel." The young woman. In other words, a girl who is of marriageable age and can bear a child, right? When this word Alma in Hebrew gets translated into Greek in the Septuagint, it becomes Parthenos, which means virgin, one who has not had sexual relations. There is no sense of sexual relations in the Hebrew term Alma. But when the Bible comes to be the Hebrew Bible comes to be translated into Greek, now that nuance is added to the term. So now we have this assumption that because of the fulfillment of prophecy, Mary is just not a young woman who brings the Messiah into the world, but she is a young woman who extraordinarily also is a virgin, which opens the door to all kinds of other issues that we're going to talk about. So this is an early indication of Mary in the Gospels. She plays a huge role in the Gospel of Matthew, in the first couple of chapters with, the birth of Jesus, the flight into Egypt, for example, and also in the Gospel of Luke. But there are other places prior to the crucifixion where Mary is present, and stories are told about her. In fact, I will read one that talks about, just how Jesus is kind of snippy with her. And this is that story of the wedding at Cana. And I'll just read it from the beginning. This is, actually, this would not, yeah, okay. I'm going to read verses 1 through 11 in John. Now, remember, John does not have a birth story. It has a prologue, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made through him. The light came into darkness, and the darkness knew it not. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And then, you have John the Baptist saying, behold, the Lamb of God. And then the next story, the very first story that's told about Jesus, is the turning of water into wine, the miracle at the wedding of Cana, which is a pretty good parlor trick if you can pull that off, because well, what better way to become popular as the guy who can turn water into wine. But it's important for John, because what John wants to indicate is that, the old tradition, which may be considered water, has now become enriched through the Messiah himself. So here's how this goes. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. This is Mary, was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, and this is where you kind of say, is this the Jesus that I know? And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. And he said that to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine, did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves a good wine first, and then the inferior wine. But, you have done something quite different here. You've turned that around." This is one of the only places that we hear of Mary, the mother of Jesus, in the Gospels. Another one is going to come very soon, and we'll talk about it. But let me stop there. Any response to Jesus not being very nice to his mother? The one who's going to be at the foot of the cross with him. Well, if not, let me move on. And the place that we know that Mary, the mother of Jesus, is present is at the crucifixion. I mean, this is probably one of the most common paintings in the Renaissance. We have these 3 characters. You have John, the evangelist, here dressed in red. Mary, the mother of Jesus, here dressed in blue. And of course, Mary Magdalene at the foot of the cross, continuing her devotion to Jesus as well. But it's only in John, whether you believe this, whether you want to believe it or not, it's only in John that Mary, the mother of Jesus, appears at the crucifixion. In the other Gospels, there are a number of Marys there, but not all of them are Mary, or they are not one of them, I should say, is Mary, the mother of Jesus. In fact, in the other Gospels, the women present are Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, Salome, Joanna, and some women, just some women who followed Jesus. There's something interesting that happens here, because in tradition, what happens is a conflation of these gospel stories. In the Gospel of John, Mary, the mother of Jesus, is there. She's with Mary Magdalene. She's with John, the beloved disciple. But in the other three Gospels, she's not there. But there is a woman there named Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, but more specifically, the mother of James. Now, what happens over time is that we know that James is a disciple, an apostle of Jesus. Can you hear the music going on in the background? I'm sorry, I was not aware that this was going to be part of our, part of our gig here. So what goes on is, we know that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was there. The other Gospels, we know that Mary, the mother of James, was there. So the other Gospels must be referring to Mary, who is the mother of Jesus. That being the case, James and Jesus must have been brothers. Do you see the logic there? You want to place Mary at the foot of the cross, right? But she's only there in one gospel. But you want to emphasize, well, she had to have been there in the other gospels. So the other gospel writers must have been referring to her just as Mary, the mother of James. So if she's the mother of James and also the mother of Jesus, Jesus and James must have been brothers. And this tradition develops. Nowhere in the Gospels, at least to my knowledge, does it say that James was the brother of Jesus. Tradition develops out of this as well, which brings us to an interesting question altogether. What about, Jesus and his brothers and sisters? Did he have a family? Well, guess what? In the Gospel of Mark, yes, he does. And in fact, the story is told in 3 of the Gospels, where Jesus' family, hearing that, he's off on some sort of crazy preaching tour, people go to him and say, hey, you got to rein this guy in, because he's saying some crazy things, and he may be possessed by a demon. So which was the reason why most people were crazy at the time, right? But this is what happens. Mary and her children come to try to save Jesus in this context. So this is early in the Gospel of Mark. Then his mother and brothers, Jesus' mother and brothers, came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, your mother and brothers and sisters are outside asking for you. And he replied, who are my mother and my brothers? And looking at those who sat around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. Again, Jesus not being very nice to mom, right? Denying his mother, right? She's not my mother. Everyone here is my mother. He who does the will of God is my mother and brother and sister. But this raises an interesting question, though, right? Let me get a drink of coffee here. Okay, we've established the fact that Mary was a virgin. After she had Jesus, obviously she had other children, right? Because they're asking for Jesus. Oh no, that can't be, because Mary must have continued to have been a virgin after the birth of Jesus. Well, then how do you explain the brothers and sisters? Now we've got a problem, right? Did Mary have children after Jesus? In other words, was Jesus the oldest, and he had a number of younger brothers and sisters? That was something that could not be considered in the early church. So a whole story has to develop around this. How then could Mary have been a virgin at birth, at the birth of Jesus, but also a perpetual virgin, a virgin who was, a virgin even at her death, which is the tradition of the Roman Catholic Church, the perpetual virginity of Mary. Well, this is where, and I've given you a link here if you ever want to go and read this, but there's a book called the Proto-Evangelium of James. James, who by the 2nd century was recognized as a brother of Jesus, and there is a gospel that is attributed to him, right? And it's, considered to be authentic by the people writing it, of course, but of course it wasn't considered to be authentic to the people who brought the gospels into the into the canonical gospels. But it's a story of Mary, and the story of Mary, it begins, with a woman named Anna and her husband Joachim, and they are childless. A common theme throughout the Old Testament, right? But, and here's where the similarity gets very clear, right? An angel appears to Mary, or excuse me, an angel appears to Anna and says to her, blessed are you among women. Never was a big soprano person, so blessed are you among women because you're going to have a child. And the suggestion here is that Anna herself is giving birth to to Mary through a kind of, a divine intervention, not by Joachim, but in the same way that Mary would give birth to Jesus. Anna gives birth to Mary in a kind of virginal way, you might say. And the child grows up and is regarded as, very, very special. And at the time of her, I think it's her 3rd birthday, she's presented at the temple. She's presented to be one of the so-called Vestal Virgins, if you want to look at a Greek tradition, who were associated with the temple and, taking care of the temple facilities. And her role, would be to spin purple. The idea was that she would be the one who would put together and spin together the cloak that would go between the Holy of Holies and the temple precincts where the priests would come. The Holy of Holies would be the place where at one time the Ark of the Covenant would have been housed, and the high priest would go in there just once a year and ask for atonement for the Jews, for the Jewish nation. It would be this veil that Mary sews together, that Mary literally spins together, spinning purple, that would be torn in half at the crucifixion. Now, remember, none of this is in the Gospels, right? None of this is there. But this is a tradition that even in the Roman Catholic Church today has been adopted. And here's where things get kind of fun. How do we explain the brothers and sisters that Jesus has? Well, here is the story of a man named Joseph. And when it came time for Mary to become a woman and needed to be married, and get this, before she started her menses, the priest wanted to make sure that she was removed from the temple because they didn't want the temple defiled, as would be the case, in the Jewish tradition, that a woman who was in her menstrual period was considered to be unclean. So we've got to find a way to get rid of Mary, right? Well, we need to marry her to someone who is upright, upstanding, and a widower who's already got children. So they sent out to all of Israel and asked the widowers to come to the temple and there will be a sign that will be given to the one that Mary should be betrothed to. So here come all of the widowers into the temple, and they're holding their staffs, and they go to each widower. And when they come to Joseph, a dove comes out of his staff, as if to say, this is the one. So now Mary is betrothed to Joseph, and she's an instant mother. Joseph has sons and daughters who will become Jesus' brothers and sisters. Do you see how the story develops? How we now can explain how Jesus had brothers and sisters. They weren't real brothers and sisters. They were step brothers and sisters. Jesus was the youngest. He was born of a virgin. Mary continues to be a virgin even after Jesus is born. So all of this develops around Mary herself. And, nowhere do we find it in the New Testament. But eventually, over time, we're going to see a developing theme in the Roman Catholic Church. And it really begins in the Orthodox tradition. There is something rather mysterious about a woman who can bear God. If we assume, as the Gospel of John does, that Jesus was God and the Word becomes flesh and dwells among us, then there is a time when a woman bears God himself, and thus can be considered the so-called mother of God, the Theotokos, the mother, literally the bearer of God. And so in the Greek Orthodox tradition, the Byzantine era, Mary came to be venerated as that, as this woman who mysteriously was able to bear God into the world, and thus had this very special relationship with God. But it was in the Middle Ages, especially, that in the Roman Catholic tradition, that Mary really came to be venerated. And it's something that I would like to look into more, because it happens at a time, if you want to think of in terms of Jungian psychology, and that cultures have a kind of psychic nuance to them. And, Carl Jung believed that archetypal images in the human psyche are balanced. For me as a male, I have something known as an anima, which is a female version of my soul. Every male has an anima, every female has an animus, so there's this balance. There's a male and female side to our sense of identity, our spiritual sense of identity. And the same may be true of whole cultures, right? But something happens in the Middle Ages around the end of the 11th century called scholasticism. And scholasticism is this very strong emphasis upon Aristotelian logic to try to explain theology. You might know about Thomas Aquinas, for example. Thomas Aquinas, who wrote the so-called Summa Theologica, which tried in a very systematic fashion through reason to explain the theology of the church. And he's considered to be one of the great scholars in the church. But this became the emphasis in the Roman Catholic tradition, a very, very reasoned approach to understanding the role of Jesus, the role of God in the world and in creation. But it's interesting because precisely at this time, when there was so much emphasis being placed upon what we might call, male-oriented reason, that something in the psyche of Europe, of the European church, kind of welled up to counteract that tradition. And it's precisely at this time that Mary, the mother of Jesus, comes to be venerated, almost worshiped, right? Almost worshiped. The veneration of Mary, there's, when people pray to Mary, in asking, that, she intercede for them, this strong tradition almost looks as if Mary herself is being worshipped. And this is one of the reasons the reformers wanted nothing to do with it, right? Mary hardly really plays a role in the New Testament or in the Gospels. She's not mentioned actually anywhere else directly in Acts chapter 1, verse 14, but nowhere else is she mentioned in the rest of the New Testament. And even in the early church fathers, not much of a mention. But this tradition develops in the Middle Ages, which is very, very oriented toward an emphasis, what we might say, on the divine feminine. Mary is not a god, but she's as close to it as you could possibly get. And it was a necessary outgrowth, you might say, a necessary counteraction to the strong emphasis on the, this masculine type of reason, this domination of the church by, the male psyche. So the need for, if you might use the Jungian archetype, the need for an archetypal mother in the presence of, a stern, overbearing father in the church at the time. So Mary comes to be seen and highly venerated, almost worshipped. There's something very interesting about, in the Greek, I should say, in the Orthodox tradition, something known as the Dormition of Mary, or the Assumption of Mary in Roman Catholicism. But in the Greek Orthodox tradition, it's the idea that Mary does not die, but simply goes to sleep. Christ descends and takes her, you can see here's Jesus, and he is holding Mary, the soul of Mary, dressed in white, holding the soul of Mary, and is going to ascend to heaven with her. It's a really interesting juxtaposition, isn't it? When you consider, on the one hand, Mary holding the babe Jesus, and the mother of God, and then now at Mary's death, or her dormition, literally meaning her falling asleep, Jesus becomes the mother of Mary and will take her to heaven. Another image that I find very interesting here, that Michelangelo in the 15th century, there's a sense, now we know, at the base of the Isenheim Altarpiece, the story is that Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary Magdalene and John, the beloved disciple, are there removing Jesus from the cross. And of course, his body will be taken into a tomb that's provided for them by Joseph of Arimathea. But Michelangelo adds a new twist to this, right? Now, we've seen how Jesus is nurtured in all kinds of Renaissance paintings by Mary. Oh, excuse me, I don't know what happened there. Nurtured by Mary. Here she is with the halo. And this is the image in the Isenheim Altarpiece. The babe, Jesus, in swaddling clothing, being held by Mary. Michelangelo wants to juxtapose this image of the birth of Jesus with the death of Jesus. And nowhere do we have this reference in scripture that Mary holds Jesus in her lap. In fact, I can't imagine a woman doing this with a full-grown man. But the sculpture here, the so-called pietà, which means mourning, grief, offers just this really, really profound juxtaposition that speaks to the essence of motherhood, really, or so many have been told. This idea of holding, and by the way, during the AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s, the Pietà became a symbol of those suffering over the loss of their sons. But looking at how, Jesus is held by Mary as a child, and once again, how Jesus is held by Mary, after his crucifixion. Very, very powerful. And it was Michelangelo who had this insight that would allow that to be brought forth from the stone, from marble. So I've been trying to speak over the La Traviata, or whatever it is that's going on next door. I hope that hasn't been too much of a distraction. It has been for me, so I have to apologize for that. Are there any questions or comments that we could that you would like to offer before I move on to a sermon that I'm going to preach here at the UCC Church? Yeah, go ahead, Lynn.
I have a question. I assume at some point there have been measurements made of the Pietà, and how big would Mary have to be, and how small would Jesus have to be? That's a good
question, because you can see very clearly here. Oh boy, and we could spend another hour on this. Mary, no, I don't apologize, because that's just a wonderful observation. Mary obviously looks about another eighth or another sixth as large as Jesus, right? But remember, this is the 15th century, right at the middle of a time when Mary is at the peak of her veneration. Jesus almost looks dwarfed in this. There's no doubt that Jesus, well, I can't say that for sure, but it's highly likely that Jesus was much bigger than his mother, Mary. But here, and this is such a great observation, it almost necessarily needs to be made smaller, as if to draw attention almost to this, image that was everywhere in the 15th and we know in the early 16th century. But I'm going to have to look into that, Lynn. I love every class I teach and learn something new. And I had never thought about that. What made you think about that? Can I ask?
Well, partly it's the view of the photo.
Yeah.
I have seen the Pietà, but it's been decades, and I don't remember being struck by that when I saw it. But this particular photo view really emphasizes, I think, how big her lap is. Her lap is huge.
Yeah. And Mary as the Theotokos, the mother of God, the bearer of God, there's just such a dynamic wealth of interpretations that can go on here, knowing how the veneration of Mary has developed over 15 centuries. But it's certainly, I'm sure Michelangelo has in mind all of these images of Mary holding the child Jesus in her arms. And, he's doing something quite extraordinary here. And you probably wouldn't have seen it, decades ago and thought this very thing. Well, because you're Protestant and and it probably wasn't put in juxtaposition with other images that would have been in the minds of people in the church at that time, right? But when you put it next,
I was in high school. It never would have occurred to me.
Oh, yeah. Well, this is probably one of the few benefits of being older and of older age, being elderly, so to speak. You've got a whole wealth of experience, including motherhood, to look back on. But thank you for that, because I had never noticed that either. Yeah, go ahead, Will.
Well, that's a really good question. I like that a lot. The other question I have is the immense amount of drapery, especially near the bottom. It's fold after fold after fold. Now, my understanding is the artist used a lot of mathematics.
Yeah.
So how that figures, maybe that doesn't figure in at all. But there must be some point to the proportions. That's, I guess, what I'm suggesting, but I don't get it.
Yeah. No, I'm sure. Yeah, mathematics. What we know just from the sculptors that we know in Hastings, who put together these bronze sculptures. For example, the sculpture on the Hastings College campus of the band playing. It's a 7/8 representation. And the mathematics that have to go into that are extraordinary, really, when you think about it. All things that I can't even begin to speak to, because I don't even know how to begin doing that. But this would have been the time, Da Vinci, Michelangelo, taking advantage of some of the mathematical insights that came, frankly, from Islam after the Crusades, and applying those to art and dimension and perspective that allowed for something as complex as this. But your eye is definitely drawn towards Mary, and Jesus is almost dwarfed by her. It's fascinating, really. But on that fascinating note, I must be on my way. And I apologize. I did not know that we would have this kind of distraction today. It really messes things up a little bit. But I hope it distracted me, and I hope my thinking wasn't too muddled as a result of it. But that being the case, I'm going to move on. You guys have fun. It's a terrible day. 5 inches of rain last night. I don't remember that much rain at all in a long time. So, but I will see you probably Wednesday, when we won't have.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks,
Yeah.
everyone.
All right. We'll see you later.
Dan, Dan, Jenny and I will be in Omaha, and not sure I will be back for Wednesday noon.
Okay. Good to know. Thank you. Bye, everyone.